Welcome to Puritan Reformers and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is Melinda Cole Klein. Historians, including myself, trace the origins of democracy and legacy of representative government to Puritanism, established in New England from the 1630s. The 1620s and the ensuing decade of the 1630s were challenging times to the British people, especially true to a growing number of property owners who believed the Anglican Church of England required moderate reforms to be a true Christian church. Separatists in England declared the king and his priests had no rightful authority over them. This made them a radical element. Many were harassed or arrested. Some left the country, such as the Scrooby congregation, who made a place in history by founding a colony in southern New England. English Puritans were not dissenters but reformers. They did not desire a break from the King's Church, but advocated to reform it. But after the Pilgrims founded their colony and a new king was crowned in 1625, life in England for the middle-class Puritans seemed to go from bad to worse. In England during the Middle Ages, Parliament represented the interests of landowners, merchants, and bankers, as well as the clergy and the nobility, a counterweight to the power of the monarch. Members of Parliament generally upheld the requests of kings as well as the wishes of commoners. Both groups were not above the law, subject to the rule of law regardless of wealth, influence, or power, or lack thereof. Backed by the Magna Carta of 1215, Parliament's two-house legislature operated under the same theory later adopted by the American Republic to create a U.S. Congress. Number one, an elected political body made up of two aspects of society. Number two, the educated and wealthy offered wisdom, the House of Lords in the UK and the Senate in the US. Number three, concerns of average folk, the House of Commons in the UK and the House of Representatives in the United States. This two-house system served as a moderator, subject to review with checks and balances, in order to limit the personal aims of despotic rulers or self-serving politicians. Most important, Parliament wanted to control the national budget, granting money to the king only after he requested it, and then only after they decided he should have it. The Scottish successors to the English throne from 1603 had little respect for Parliament, the Magna Carta, and little appreciation for English ways and history in general. With the new king, Charles I, in 1625, he insisted that parliamentary powers had been granted at his pleasure, and he could have them revoked whenever he chose. And he would shock his subjects when he dismissed Parliament 3 times between 1625 and 1629, ultimately ordering Parliament from meeting until he called them, resolving to rule without them. This was the political climate in which Brits lived and worked. By the end of the 1620s, Puritan-minded Massachusetts Bay members planned and executed their self-funded migration. The English social origins of the Massachusetts Puritans are as follows. In regards to wealth, they comprised mostly of the landowning gentry, professional class, and merchant middle class. Poverty. Very few people came from the lower ranks of society. In 1632, using 3 occupational lists, only 5% of colonists were listed as laborers. Only 25% came as servants. Where this number was for Virginia, 75% came from the lower ebbs of society and also as indentured servants. 75% of Massachusetts immigrants paid their own passage, and this cost ranged from between 50 and 80 pounds, and this was no small sum. Because a farmer in Massachusetts could only hope to clear 2 to 3 pounds a year after expenses, the average English family could not afford to immigrate. Literacy rate was high. Their origin, urban in population, 30% came from small English market towns, 30% from large market towns, while another 30% came from farming village hamlets. Between 50 and 60% of Puritans had pursued a skilled trade before leaving England. About 2/3 to 3/4 of Puritans can trace their heritage to 9 counties of East Anglia. This area is northeast of London. Thus, Massachusetts Puritans carried with them similar styles of dress, manners, customs, and beliefs. These Puritans from East Anglia settled in New England to create a godly society 3,000 miles away. Massachusetts Puritans combined theology, politics, and economics into a well-run and orderly society, offering cohesion and a tight sense of community. How did they do this? Well, unlike in Virginia, Boston leaders deeded the rights to establish towns and own land based on the principle that family homes should be close to town to allow residents the ability to attend worship, which was required, to attend town meetings, a community responsibility to ensure order in the town, and to provide neighborly community involvement. Know your neighbors to ensure no sin comes to your community. These were the Massachusetts Puritans. A number of influential merchants, landowners, and members of Parliament were Puritans. With the coronation of Charles I in 1625, they spoke out against rule by a tyrant king, loss of their liberties, arbitrary taxes, and were devoted to the cause of religious freedom. Charles believed firmly in the divine right of kings, as his father had, and his relations with Parliament steadily worsened. Finally, in 1629, Charles dismissed Parliament after the king was refused money. For the next 11 years, the king ruled alone, obtaining needed cash by forcing loans from wealthy men and creating arbitrary taxes on the people. This was considered by Englishmen to be illegal. In religious matters, among other things, the king appointed William Laud to manage the Church of England affairs by becoming in time the Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud was disliked by many English Puritans because of the following 4 reasons. His devotion to the elaborate Anglican ceremonies, richly ornamental clothing similar to priests. His determination to enforce laws against persons who did not uphold the ways of the Anglican Church, and these would be dissenters like the Puritans and the Separatists. Laud enforced Puritans to toe the line by cutting Puritan minister salaries and those employed by the state as civil servants. As a 4th point, for Puritans who protested too loudly, they were jailed. To make matters worse, Charles I and the members of his court lived extremely well on the tax money that Puritans and other Englishmen contributed. Puritans saw this gaudy lifestyle as immoral. Ultimately, this situation would lead to a civil war in the 1640s between the Puritan-led Parliament and the King's Army, remembered as Loyalists or the King's Cavaliers. In the end, Parliament won the war and the King lost his head after being found guilty of treason against the state. In 1625, the Council of New England obtained a patent to establish fishing colonies in New England. While only a footnote in history, the Dorchester Company, these were the proposed settlers, soon ran out of money to establish New England fishing colonies and had to abandon their plans. The interest, though, did not die here. The Massachusetts Bay Company, headed by Puritan John Endicott, purchased the rights to establish colonies. By 1628, a few Puritans moved to Massachusetts to establish the town of Salem. By the 1630s, many Puritans lost hope that reforms were possible in England. While the immigration of thousands of Puritans during the 1630s created a New England in North America, they had not foreseen a civil war was coming, ridding the nation of the king and the tyranny at large. John Winthrop, a member of the landed gentry, lawyer, justice of the peace, lord of the manor, hearing court cases, and Puritan, considered the idea of leaving England too. Under the terms of the charter, company members or freemen were to meet 4 times a year in a general court of their own making, to pass laws, admit new members, and elect officers, including a governor and assistants. Because the company was not required to make its headquarters in England, and new members intended to immigrate, the colony would govern itself and not be ruled by a company council in England. History remembers John Winthrop as the first elected governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He joined the company in July 1629 and within 3 months was chosen governor of the proposed colony. He was Cambridge educated and studied law at Gray's Inn in London. Succeeded his father as master of the family estate in 1618. John Winthrop, sadly, was twice a widower. For the 3rd time he married, and this was Margaret Tyndall, his most favorite wife. By 1627, he was appointed Justice of the Peace, obtained a minor government job in London as an attorney. In 1629, at the time of joining the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he had 7 sons. 1 was wayward, disobedient, and he also had a daughter. Winthrop possessed a strong sense of community responsibility, rooted in his religious beliefs. He believed in reform of the Anglican Church because Puritan values were the foundation of their faith. As in Winthrop's letters to his wife indicated during the period, he was discouraged with life in England under Charles I. Why was this? His estates were not producing as well as they had done in the past. Winthrop was in debt. The token lawyer job he had taken in London ending up letting him go, and he was unemployed. One of his sons was spending too much time and money. Financially, Winthrop was unable to provide the university funds necessary to educate his elder sons. And after meeting with the Massachusetts Bay Company members, America loomed large as better opportunities for his sons, economic prosperity, and freedom to create a perfect, godly community. Still, the move involved risk. Nonetheless, he would in time put his estate up for sale and make this move possible. A fleet of 17 ships carried Puritans to Massachusetts Bay during the summer of 1630. By the end of 1630, 200 ships transported passengers to Boston, averaging 100 persons per vessel. Traveling across the Atlantic between 1630 and 1641 was busy. One immigrant commented that on his journey he counted no less than 13 ships in mid-passage from England to New England. However, this migration from England was not limited to the British American colonies. In this decade, 20,000 Britons left for Ireland, tens of thousands moved to the German Rhineland region, the Netherlands, the Caribbean islands of the West Indies, including Barbados, Nevis, St. Kitts, and the now defunct colony established as Providence Island. The first wave of Massachusetts settlement sailed from England, arriving 3 months later in June 1630. Including the flagship, protected with 28 guns, remembered as the Arabella, carrying John Winthrop and his sons and fellow Englishmen, women, and children. For the migrating Puritans, a sinful and hopeless life in England lay behind them. Winthrop and his fellow English families landed on June 11, 1630. Summer, a good time to arrive in New England. These founding families that arrived in Massachusetts from 1629, this would be the early settlers, and those arriving by 1640, numbered about 21,000 in all, and are ancestors of American Yankees. Their numbers increased rapidly. 100,000 by 1700, 1 million by 1800, 6 million by 1900, 16 million by 1990, to whom all are descended from the original 21,000 Great Migration settlers. So these are the years between 1629 and 1640. People of Yankee origins can trace their immigrant heritage to within 5 years of 1635. The children of the Great Migration migrated from New England over the years to form in time the English ancestry base that dominated the U.S. population. The British ancestry base in America remained 80% until the 1920s. The establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by design was a family plan. 94% of colonists arrived in family groups, and this was only the beginning. As mentioned, 21,000 English citizens would migrate to Massachusetts, establishing fishing, trading, seaport towns, and farming communities far into the interior. Weak with malnutrition and scurvy, Winthrop considered how they would survive the cold winter that lay a few months ahead. Little is known about Winthrop's movements during these first few months. And when he did write home, he asked his wife to send on the next ship bound for Boston food and shelter supplies. 200 migrants died that first winter before a supply ship arrived in February 1631 carrying lemon juice and other provisional needs that helped to stave off the effects of scurvy. While some Puritans decided to return to England that spring, those who stayed planted crops, located fishing grounds, and opened a fur trade with natives. Salem and Cambridge were Massachusetts colony towns as well. Winthrop did not lose faith in the success of the colony. This would be the only starving period in the colonial period of Massachusetts. Boston would become the political and economic center of the colony in time. The Puritans believed in Winthrop's famous words that, quote, "As a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in his work, we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." End of quote. This was the mission statement of the colony. Boston and outlying towns admonished this mantra in church, in town meetings, with each other, and as a community. This philosophy helped the first 3 generations hold fast to their ideals held by their colonial founders. Religion was the main force impelling them to seek refuge in New England. Puritans believed that they were God's chosen people, here on earth not only to prepare for heaven, but to glorify him. The best way to do this was to perform good works in which men could live in prosperous harmony with one another. This would be the most pleasing in the sight of God, and if the community succeeded, this in itself would be proof that the Puritans had done well in the eyes of God. By the 3rd generation, the New England Puritan society was in transition. In established towns like Boston, Puritan ministers viewed as old lights were losing their authority and its solitary grip on society, politics, and the culture in general due to the influences of immigrant diversity and the effects of the First Great Awakening. In the countryside and in smaller towns, the Puritan ethos was affected, sometimes not at all, or similar to that in Boston. Relations with the Indians, whom at first the Puritans considered untutored children, were fair in the beginning. Puritans aimed to Christianize and educate Indians as well as carry on peaceful trade with them. A number of Indians adopted Christianity, but in general Puritan beliefs were not welcome. In time, regarding trade, Indians became resentful of Puritan traders and merchants as more and more settlers were seen, and as the reason why the amount of food, game, fowl, fish, and fruit supplies dwindled. The summer that the Indians and the English clashed hit a threshold, and this was the year of 1636. War began in earnest. The Pequot of 1637, this war was short, bloody, and brutal. Without mercy on both sides, women, children, the elderly were killed, chopped, and clubbed one another. The Pequot tribe was nearly wiped out. However, John Winthrop, until his death in 1649, would continue his friendship with the few Pequot members that survived. Supernatural events, these would be disease, storms, and raids, were interpreted by a minister and congregations as sign of God's wrath. Peace and prosperity were signs of his pleasure. Legal sanctions, community pressures, fear of God's displeasure, and the promise of material reward from good works helped to maintain the church's authority among those who had not been converted. But life in Puritan New England was narrow, was not as strict as many commonly assume. Puritans drank in taverns, allowed books to be imported. They did not consider sex bad or evil, but they condemned extramarital sex. But they did frown on theater, though not opposed to music. They were opposed to singing, except for prayer songs, but without musical instruments, as they were not allowed in church. Puritan leaders were soon embroiled in a controversy which had both political and religious overtones. Soon after settlement of Boston, Anne Hutchinson began to create trouble and stir up dissent within the congregation, making herself a threat to the entire authority of the Puritan Church and community at large. Anne was an antinomian, a sect which believed that only faith was necessary for conversion. Good works, these being church attendance, participation in ceremonies, and even hard work, were not needed. This meant that ministers were not needed to attain God's grace and salvation. Antinomianism, a radical church doctrine, challenged the religious and social discipline Puritan leaders sought to maintain in the colony. While her ideals were radical, Anne was popular. When John Winthrop in 1637 was the Massachusetts Bay Governor, he, having a keen wit and bold spirit, was determined to stamp out antinomianism and other influences that were infecting the colony. Anne Hutchinson and her brother-in-law John Wheelwright and other antinomians went into exile, away from the Puritan settlement. Roger Williams had given them refuge in the settlement of Providence, Rhode Island. After several years, Anne and her children, except for one, were killed by natives in a raid. Puritan leaders considered this conclusive proof that his displeasure with her. God had punished her for her sins. Nearly 40 years later, in 1675, the Wampanoag and Narragansett tribes spread death and destruction along the New England frontier, known as King Philip's War, named after the Wampanoag chief who began the hostilities. The Indians killed settlers, cattle, destroyed crops, and burned settlements. But there were far too many colonists to drive out or kill now, and with 4,000 Christian Indian native groups, they were divided in their efforts. After several months of bloody fighting, the Indians were defeated, and their power in southern New England was broken forever. Despite Puritan efforts to maintain the old teachings and the old ways, change to Massachusetts Bay Colony was inevitable. This was noticeable among the members of the second generation of Puritans, and by the time the third generation reached adulthood, it was obvious. A new kind of New Englander, the Yankee, had begun to emerge, and eventually this character and interest would dominate the economic, political, and social life of the colony. The conflict between the Yankee's desire to get on in the world with his passion for righteousness would be reflected in New England's role in the history of slavery in America. Yankee merchants, sea captains, and others prospered, and many became very wealthy men through supplying slaves to southern colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet it was among the Yankees of New England that the abolition movement of the early 18th and 19th centuries drew its greatest support. Perhaps prosperity was responsible for the Puritan's transition to Yankee, and given his religious convictions, it was probably inevitable that he would prosper. Originally, the Puritans had planned to base the colony's economic survival on an agricultural plantation system like that of Virginia, but the thin, rocky soil made it impossible in New England. They instead turned to the sea, and by the 1640s, commerce and shipbuilding had replaced agriculture as the colony's leading source of income. Boston became its busiest seaport, with ships coming from Europe, other colonies, and the West Indies. In addition, land speculation became a booming business. With material abundance of prosperity, allowing prosperous trading families to amass wealth, the sin of pride began to creep into Puritan attitudes. No longer did they attribute their success to God alone. They took some credit for their own resourcefulness and energy in their hard work. Commercially, Massachusetts Bay had almost prospered from the start, from shipping and commercial enterprises, connected by mariners willing to sell local goods to urban traders in faraway lands, in exchange for manufactured and luxury goods from Europe, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. James II became apprehensive about the New England colonies' increasingly independent ways and disregard for trade stipulations established in the Navigation Acts. All the while, a continuing military threat by the French and their Indian allies loomed large in North America. This was an additional reason to tighten control of the colonies. In 1686, all of New England was joined in an administrative merger, remembered as the Dominion of New England. 2 years later, New York and both New Jerseys were added. This agency's creation was regarded in Britain as a thoughtful move and not a punitive measure. Unifying the North American colonies for purposes of defense and administrative control was viewed very differently in America. The colonists had earlier participated in the New England Confederation. Shortly after, in 1688-1689, England went through another revolution, this time a bloodless one. To Protestant landowning parliamentary Englishmen, the fact that James II was Catholic was bad enough, but when he baptized his son a Catholic, he went too far. By now, Parliament was too strong and influential for a monarch to get away with such un-English behavior. Parliament deposed the king and invited his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange in the Netherlands to be king and queen of England. James fled to France. Parliament justified its action by John Locke's constitutional theory that the existence of government rested on the consent of the governed. In 1691, Massachusetts received a new charter, making it a royal colony with a governor appointed by the Crown. Self-government and home rule was over forever. Their future was uncertain. However, William and Mary were well loved in the colonies, allowing the colonies to prosper and grow. However, with uncertain times ahead, and the colony of Massachusetts in transition regarding its core character from Puritan to Yankee, leadership from the spirit established by John Winthrop was fading. His sons and grandsons were not interested in colonial politics, but dedicated most of their time to land speculation and managing the family estate. Established Puritan ministers became known as Old Lights, outdated, authoritarian, and out of touch with the growing numbers of Puritans engaged in competitive, merchant-based economies. Increase and Cotton Mather, New England's best-known ministers, were old school by the 1720s. As British American seaport towns developed in the 17th century, trading areas in New England fractured into a series of shipbuilding commercial towns that engaged in mercantile trade and rural farming communities. Salem Town and Salem Village, while economic differences widened each year and probate disputes over inheritance issues continued to increase, Salem Town residents increased their wealth, purchased more imported luxuries, and had nice homes as compared to those in Salem Village. Thus, in Salem Town, they enjoyed a better standard of living. Salem Town residents differed from their sometimes envious rural relatives. Only 6 miles away in Salem Village, these residents struggled year after year to make a living from the land, in which most remained poor farmers. In addition, these villagers finally had their own church by 1689, after repeated town pleas for one, but the villagers disagreed if Dr. Paris was actually the right minister for their farming community. The new village minister, Samuel Paris, had 3 children. He arrived to serve the village congregation from the Barbados, with 2 slaves in tow. It was from this household the accusations of witchcraft would commence. On the increase, Salem village girls devolved into fantasies, undetected by adults, in efforts to resist the strict cultural norms. The first accusations of witchcraft were made by Salem village girls Betty Paris, age 9, and Abigail Williams, age 11, daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Paris. All the while, Massachusetts had a new charter by 1691. The future of residents across the colony was uncertain. While this change in the British monarchy would prove to be a positive one for colonists, this was not yet acknowledged. In this climate of jealousy, political change, and rising wealth by town residents, it is not surprising villagers started accusing their neighbors of wrongdoing. All the while, and in time, the wheels of justice visited this New England seaport community with a series of criminal trials heard by county magistrates, until the trials were moved to Boston Supreme Court by January 1693, and spectral evidence was no longer allowed. The trials continued from May to November of 1692. In light of economic, religious, and political fracturing between Salem Town and Village, a series of events transpired, ultimately causing hundreds of people to be accused of unchristian-like behavior, 19 to be hung, and 1 man was crushed to death. 5 died awaiting trial as well. It would be not until 1957 the last 9 condemned of witchcraft would be exonerated from their crimes. The First Great Awakening started in the 1730s and had a 10-year run. With religious piety in decline, touring evangelists such as George Whitefield performed open-air sermons to huge crowds. While Puritan communities remained steadfast in their beliefs and Bible-reading practices, other Protestant communities found Puritanism was not suitable for them, as the vast majority of frontier families could not read or congregate easily, thus forming solid religious communities. The population in the colonies moved around a lot too, and when land became scarce, sons moved to the frontiers, and this broke former religious and family ties. In the northern colonies, literacy was on the rise. New England and Pennsylvania colonists placed a high emphasis on educating their children. This was especially true for Puritans in Massachusetts. In 1647, a mandate required every town to support a school. A modest network of public schools resulted. George Whitefield in his sermons emphasized that it was possible for everyone to have a relationship with God, that they did not need leaders in their community, or was it necessary to read the Bible. Many colonists had headed west to start their own farms and towns, taking this highly emotional religious fervor with them. The teaching by the new evangelicals denounced reading of the Bible, which for many was a hindrance to salvation. This new type of religion appealed to poor farming families, the uneducated, especially women and blacks. While New Englanders were firmly established in their belief of youthful education, Quakers and others provided church schools, and other colonial children were educated at home or by unmarried women holding private classes in their houses. In cities, master craftsmen set up schools for their apprentices. Free African American colonists in commercial seaport towns made use of the apprentice system as well. But slaves had no access to public education. Occasionally, a master or mistress would teach a slave children to read and write, but as the slave system became more entrenched, social sanctions discouraged this practice. In 1636, Harvard was founded by Puritans, aimed to produce ministers to teach Native Americans and colonists about God. Other institutions followed to include the College of William and Mary by 1693. The growing dissatisfaction with conservative religious liberalism created Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, while others followed. In 1702, Cotton Mather wrote that Harvard College, found in 1636, was the best thing that New England ever thought upon. This rather old-styled Puritan minister related here that education influenced a force upon the Yankee culture. Mather was not just a minister, but interested in recording snowfalls and other climatic events. He used the microscope, collected fossils, and became the first advocate of the germ theory of the transmission of communicable diseases. At Harvard, while it was created to offer men degrees as ministers, by 1700 courses included mathematics, geometry, physics, astronomy, and botany. Puritans, unlike Catholics, viewed science as an ally of religion rather than an enemy of it. A period of Boston's rapid commercial growth is measured in part by the number of wealthy merchant families who lived there, constituting a healthy middle-class economy. Shipbuilding continued due to demand and influence of the construction of warehouses, while Yankees showed their commercial success by creating stately buildings for trading activities and congregation. Yankees became desirous of manufactured goods from England and Europe, such as velvet, lace, dining room table linens, drapes, silverware, books, furniture, and coaches, not of the quality made in the colonies. Homes of the 18th century Boston merchants and officials reflected a knowledgeable interest in fine art, architecture, and artisan crafts. For those that could afford it, brick two-story homes in town were preferred. New public buildings and expanded literary tastes gave evidence of the change from the spiritually oriented Puritan to the materialistic Yankee. The break was neither sudden nor complete. Not until 1750 were Bostonians permitted to put on a theater play. Amusement for most New Englanders was provided by festivals and holidays rather than by formal entertainment. Although there was no fixed Thanksgiving Day during the colonial period, a town might proclaim a day of Thanksgiving for a good harvest, an escape from an epidemic, or some other of the Lord's favors. Christmas, which Puritans did not celebrate, might be honored by firing muskets, feasting, and visiting neighbors. Most popular forms of celebration were election days, military regalia and parades, and college commencement at Yale and Harvard. This slide is self-explanatory. It illustrates characteristics of the Yankee middle class, New England's political and economic founding families. It would be these families who would form colonial policies and customs. The influence of these families cannot be overestimated. Their wealth, opinions, steadfast belief in the common good, political ideals, economic endeavors, and overall social character would leave an indelible mark on American society. As mentioned, most historians have traced the beginnings of democracy in America to Puritanism. Puritanism contained three major democratic features. Number one, common consent. Church congregations deliberated and elected their own ministers. Number two, short hierarchy of authority. The congregational plan of church organization, with at most a small group of local ministers collectively, at times, might influence a minister preaching in their local area. Number three, characteristics of self-regulation and self-responsibility across one's life was the making of a good Protestant. The Yankee was a product of native conditions, supported by religious beliefs to prosper at one's work. Thus, Yankees created an economy that was supported in its efforts to get on with life, resulting in wealth, a clear sign that God favored hard-working individuals. From the 1630s, Puritan town leaders across New England specifically encouraged education of the youth. For every 25 families, a school and one teacher had to be established and paid a salary. While other British American colonies did not offer state-supported education, this was available in New England. In addition, apprenticeship by children, especially after the grammar school age of 11, was not only customary, but was the only system in which the majority of young adults became skilled in the arts to earn money and to support a family.